Perfect. Perfect, thank you. Okay, that's perfect, thank you.
I just want to confirm our presenters, so Andrina and Lauren are not a part of the presentation today. Is that true?
Yes, so it's going to be Danica, Beverly, and Jolene today.
Okay, perfect. So I'll move them over.
Thanks.
Vanished.
Vanished.
If I can just add that we've got interpreters and cart services going on as well, so that people need to pace themselves while they're speaking and try not to rush. The interpreters will have to keep up as well as the cart riders. So let's try to make sure that people are pacing themselves so that we get the full interpretation, especially with regard to your bios, given they don't know who you are. But when you're talking about names of universities and names of things in particular, if you could just slow that down a little bit, because all those have to be spelled. Thanks.
If at any point you need us to slow down, just let us know as well.
Also for the captionist, I'm not sure if anyone can see, but she wanted to do a test, but I was the only one on the call, and I don't have the captioning turned on because my screen reader will go crazy. So if someone could just let her know that they can see it, that everything is good, that would be much appreciated.
I can see it. It's working fine.
Thank you.
Larissa, it's Jolene. I'm just conscious. I've told my children to be quiet and to try and keep the dogs quiet. But if something happens and I have to mute, are you able to switch people just in case?
Yes.
I'm hoping not, but I've warned them, but I do have the two kids and the two dogs.
No worries.
And the office door is closed.
Yeah, I think we're all broadcasting from home, so background noise happens.
Okay.
We'll
and
cross
I
our
have
fingers.
headphones in, hopefully, but they are like the iPhone ones or whatever you call them, earphones, whatever. I don't remember what they're called, but you know, sometimes they pick up the noises on the outside.
Mm-hmm. We'll cross our fingers.
Yeah, I've warned them, so let's hope so.
It's Ryan here. We do have some people in the gallery. We'll be starting in about 4 minutes.
Okay.
Just letting
Thanks,
everyone know.
Ryan.
1 minute, guys.
Excuse me.
Can take it away, Sherry, when you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Hello and welcome to day 4 of our 5-day webinar series called Life Made Accessible, Accessing the Future, in honor of National Accessibility Week, which takes place from May 31st to June 4th. Our event is an opportunity to see into the lives being presented to you. We hope it will give better understanding of the paths that some individuals with disabilities need to take. With understanding, we hope it will lead to a world more accessible. My name is Sherry Roberts, and I work for the Independent Living Center as a Community Resource Coordinator, and today I am your host. For today's webinar, we will look at accessible communication and information distribution. But before we begin, just a couple of points. The spirit of this event is an opportunity for learning. Our panelists will be sharing personal experiences and perspectives. This is their story. They do not speak on behalf of all individuals living with a disability. We encourage you to comment and ask questions to our panelists throughout the webinar using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. The last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together will be dedicated to answering some of your questions. Please remember to be appropriate and courteous. We are pleased to provide both CART transcription and interpretation services for today's webinar. To enable closed captioning, click on the closed caption button on the bottom of your Zoom window and then choose subtitles. Just a reminder to please speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can capture all of your messages. To begin, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Larissa Proctor. Larissa works with the CNIB Foundation as lead for advocacy, curriculum development, and community engagement. In addition to breaking barriers for people who are blind or partially sighted, Larissa is passionate about LGBTQ+ issues, writing, weightlifting, eating great vegan food, and spending time outdoors with the world's cutest guide dog. Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome everyone. Have you ever wondered how you can make your meetings or events more inclusive for everyone? Today, we will learn about what you can do to improve access to information and communication in your workplace. Our panelists will discuss accessible documents, accessible meetings and events, workplace inclusion and equity, and barriers to information and communication during the pandemic. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Beverly Dooley is the Manager of Client Engagement at Canadian Hearing Services. She believes in providing ongoing education for service providers, interpreters, and the deaf and hard of hearing community. Beverly has worked closely with deaf and hard of hearing individuals, service providers, and organizations to raise awareness and promote skills in areas such as deaf culture and community, communication access, leadership, and the rights of deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Beverly enjoys reading, cooking, baking, and spending time with her family and friends. Danica Blackstock is a registered social worker who graduated from the University of Waterloo. She currently works at CNIB as the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Specialist. Danica believes that everyone deserves equitable access to information and communication, and that removing barriers to information and communication allows everyone to thrive. Jolene Mcdonald is the founder of Accessibrand, an innovative design, marketing, and communications business for and by people with disabilities. She has more than 20 years of experience in the graphic design and marketing industry, as well as 18 years experience as an entrepreneur, designer, creative director, and illustrator. These experiences, as well as her lived experience with disability, have informed her work with Accessibrand. Jolene is an advocate, wife, and mother of 3. She has volunteered with Little People of Ontario and the Rare Disease Foundation, and she sits on the Grand River Accessibility Advisory Committee. We'll begin today's discussion by talking about how the pandemic has impacted access to information and communication for people with disabilities. Bev, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us how access to information and communication has been impacted by COVID-19?
Certainly. Last March, the pandemic hit the world, and we all thought it was going to be 2 weeks out of our lives. Who knew that it would still be around today? There are deaf and hard of hearing members of the community who work in hearing, or work with hearing people who don't sign. They have deaf people in residential schools, children who went home with no idea of what was going on when the pandemic first hit. Kids went home to families who often didn't sign, and they therefore didn't get an explanation of why they weren't at school anymore and why they were stuck at home. Many thought that they were being punished for some reason. They thought they were bad, or they did something that caused them to be stuck at home. And a month later, we managed to get information out to that community, understand that there was a pandemic going on. But during that first few weeks, there was no communication going on. Now you'll see that there are interpreters on media, on TV, which took at least a month to make happen before or after the pandemic started. So it was a real challenge to get information out to everyone at that time.
Thanks, Bev. Danica, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. I work with a lot of individuals and for the CNIB, so many of our clients and participants have sight loss. So when I think about the difficulty with communication, I often think about kind of the way that our stores and our other public spaces have changed given COVID-19. So things such as physical distancing, when you don't have access to that visual information, it's difficult to tell kind of the distance you are from people, and also led to discrimination for people who relied on sighted guide, the judgment from society if their disability wasn't fully visible. So having someone so close to you when there was that 6-foot physical distancing. There was also a lot of issues with the signage that was being used. So having arrows or the tape on the floors, they still are kind of some major barriers that people are facing in physical spaces. So I think a lot of the communication barrier comes from the inaccessibility of the material that is being presented to the public.
Thank you, Danica. Jolene, over to you.
Yes, I think one of the biggest problems we saw is that everything moved online, and from a marketing communications perspective, that's the only access people had. So individuals with disabilities were also forced online, but many people are not, up to code with the AODA compliance. So things were not made accessible for them, and websites have become crucial for accessing everything in the world, and they need to be accessible. So a lot of individuals weren't able to access the information that they needed to, for sure.
Thanks, Jolene. Next, we'll discuss how access to information and communication has been impacted by the move to virtual spaces. Jolene, would you like to share your thoughts from a marketing and communications perspective?
Certainly. I think a lot of people were left behind because the spaces were not made accessible. Specifically, everyone was moved to Zoom or to virtual trade show type platforms. I had to do some research for clients to find out which ones were accessible, and very few were truly user-friendly. They were using browser compliance, but they weren't actually usable from an actual personal perspective. Virtual trade shows and conferences are using software that may not be made accessible to all participants. So people were expected to participate in those types of events and were not able to fully, experience the opportunity within that. And virtual spaces, people can't rely on the same accessibility tools that they may have used in a physical space. So, closed captioning and transcripts, and even like design presentations weren't made completely accessible for people. So a lot of people have been stammering and trying to catch up to that. And it's certainly been a hindrance.
Thanks, Jolene. Bev, I'd like to ask you how the move to virtual spaces has impacted access to information and communication for people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Certainly. In the past, deaf and hard of hearing people were used to having interpreters live and in person on site, and they would interpret a variety of assignments, whether they were doctor's appointments, conferences, or anything that was out there. It would happen in person. We did offer virtual services, but only in some situations. And we always figured that that would happen at some point. It would get more popular. We had no idea we would have to learn it on the fly because of a pandemic. All of a sudden, everybody was having to be forced onto Zoom. And think about deaf and hard of hearing seniors out in the community who really aren't technologically savvy and did not know how to access things online. That required a lot of education, a lot of training, a lot of webinars to show people visually on the screen what to do, what to click, how to get the interpreter online. Yeah, experiences varied out there and they were, wow, excessive. There were a variety of webinars provided to the community to teach them how to use online tools, how to empower themselves. And it seems that that process of webinars was very successful. Clinics, doctors' offices out there quite often didn't want to use their own equipment to connect to interpreters through Zoom or whatever. So consumers were required to show up to the doctor's office and connect with the interpreter on their phone, a tiny little screen on an iPad. Now, people really do love technology in this community, especially when it comes to FaceTime, to be able to see people face to face. So Zoom took a while to get used to and is something that people are a little more comfortable with now.
Thanks, Bev. Danica, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I think in terms of kind of access to information, and the virtual space, I think in some ways there were a lot of challenges, similar to what Bev was saying. When we work with kind of an older adult population and people having access to technology as well. So I think that was a major barrier. And then understanding what technology works best for the population and having those sessions for people to participate and learn how to use these different platforms. But I think in some ways too, there's been kind of many positives that have come out of this for our client population as well. Our numbers for virtual programming allowed them to go up because people who didn't have access to transportation to get to our service centers and to participate in programming, now we're able to actually access more of our services and have that social connection in a time where social connection was and still is very important. So I think working through those barriers and figuring out how to deliver our services in a way that works best for individuals was definitely a challenge, but I think many lessons were learned for our population and groups as a whole as well from a universal design perspective. So I think even though there were many challenges, there are a lot of positives that came out of us switching to virtual programming.
Thanks, Danica. I appreciate that you're pointing out some of the positives. I know that when we think about information and communication throughout the pandemic and how things happen so quickly and people adapt so quickly, minds tend to go to the barriers and challenges. But I think it's great to remember that there are a few silver linings in there as well. So thanks for that perspective. Jolene, can you comment on building accessibility into marketing and communications materials, including social media?
Absolutely, I can certainly give some pointers. I think it's important, first and foremost, is to think about who your user audience is, and not to forget that not everyone can access information the same as the next person. So rather than building something and trying to fix it later, is to think about how you can make it inclusive and accessible from the beginning, not an afterthought. Things like websites, even digital brochures and things like that. Taking into consideration plain language, of course, color contrast, type size of typefaces, images, especially including not just an alt text tag, but some great descriptive text. Especially with social media, if you're going to post an image, make sure to describe that image, because Facebook specifically doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to give you a description. So add it below your caption. And what we always strive for is to actually test it with people with disabilities, include it. Nothing for us without us. So if you're not sure how to do that, reach out to people that do know how to do that. But certainly taking into all those considerations, even not just using visuals, but including text with your visuals. And of course, not just basing everything on color because of color blindness. So there's a lot of different aspects to be able to take into consideration to make sure it's inclusive and accessible.
Thanks, Jolene. Danica and Bev, I know that the two of you, aren't working in marketing and communications, but do you have anything else to add to what Jolene said about how we can make information and communication more accessible through social media?
It's Danica. I think, Jolene, you raised a really good point about the usability. Just because something meets accessibility standards and guidelines doesn't mean it's actually usable to an audience. So understanding that people are at kind of all different levels. For our organization, it's a lot of screen reader technology. So understanding that people shouldn't need to be an advanced user in order to interact with different websites or digital means. So kind of having that group be there to test things as well. As part of my role, we do accessibility testing for internal purposes. And I think having that user who does use the technology frequently is very important to help make sure that things are accessible.
Bev, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Just a few things. For the deaf and hard of hearing community, it is important to have a plain background. So if you're making video content on social media, and if you're signing, it is important to have a solid background. I know that many individuals don't sign, but if you are making video content, and it's important to caption your video content if you're not going to provide signed content. And I work for the Canadian Hearing Services, and our social media content that we post is both in spoken language, ASL and sign language, and it is captioned as well. And so I think that it is important. We really do all rely on social media in our lives today, far more than we did obviously 100 years ago. We would be lost without it, but it is important that it is accessible.
Thanks, Bev. Danica, can you give us some tips for making virtual meetings and events more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities?
Sure. I think it was mentioned before, but making sure accessibility is planned from the very beginning. I think a lot of times an event or a meeting is planned and then accessibility is an afterthought. And when we plan it in from the very beginning, then we can make sure that everybody has the same opportunity to interact with that meeting or event. Things like providing documents ahead of time, but also making sure that those documents are accessible. So not sending, for our example, for our population, a picture of a PDF that doesn't have the ability to have a screen reader kind of recognize what's happening. Also being mindful of, for us, we're a national organization, so time zones are a big thing. Accessibility goes beyond kind of the disability space. It also takes into account other people's kind of identity too. So being aware that people might not have access to technology or stable internet connections, and just giving a bunch of options ahead of time, I think is important, and making sure that it's asked ahead of time if there's any accommodations that you as the organizer or facilitator should be considering, so that person feels like their voice is being heard from the very beginning.
Thank you, Danica. Bev, the same question to you. How can meetings be made more accessible and inclusive?
I agree with what Danica just said, that pre-planning piece is key in asking individuals what they will need for that meeting that day. And Larissa, you know as well, we've planned in advance for this webinar, providing interpreters and the cart writers with prep materials prior to the event, so that the interpreters and cart writers are able to have that information prior to the meeting. So it's also important that we let them know how many participants are going to be involved in the meeting, and that there's someone moderating the meeting, that there's somebody moderating turn taking, that there's a speakers list, and that people are indicating who's speaking so that participants can follow along and know who is speaking. So maybe just saying your name, like, so for instance, I would say Bev speaking, or you could say Larissa speaking, and then participants are able to follow along with who is talking. I think it is important that we also manage the meeting so that the interpreters and cart writers can also keep up with the conversation and process.
Thanks, Bev. I think sorry, go ahead.
There's two platforms that I wanted to mention. Sorry to interrupt you. MS Teams and WebEx are not deaf and hard of hearing friendly platforms. When it comes to sharing documents or sharing your screen, then the participants become very small, and so you could only see, and then if you switch it, then the document is very small. So Zoom is a far more user-friendly platform when using interpretation and sharing your screen, and you're able to split the screens. If you have two monitors, then you're able to put the document on one monitor and have the interpreter on the other monitor. But if you have one monitor on some platforms, it's very difficult to see the interpreter. So that's one thing I would caution people to be aware of.
That's great information. Thank you, Bev. Jolene, did you have anything to add to what Danica and Bev have shared?
I think it's most important. I mean, I'm new to Zoom even this year myself, or in the last year and a half, is that you provide as many resources as possible for meetings, and to offer as many resources and ask people what they need. Presentations as well, because we do a lot of presentations that are visual based, is to think about how those are set up and how they portray to the person on the other side, and to be able to provide, transcripts or a copy of that at the end, but also ensuring whatever those handouts are accessible and made compliant. So I think those are really crucial pieces to online virtual meetings.
Thanks, Jolene. So given that the theme of this week's webinars is accessing the future, I'd like to ask each of you what the future of information and communication should look like. Bev, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't know. I may not be alive in 30 years from now, but 30, 40 years from now, what I hope it looks like is that communication is far more smooth for people, and that it goes easier, that providers are much more aware of what they need to do. I think that we're born educators and we're constantly educating people, and so and once we educate one person, then we move on to educate another person. But I am hopeful that the Canada Accessibility Act will open doors for individuals. This legislation will change the future, that there will be standardization for accessibility for people who are deaf and people who have disabilities, and that with the establishment of this legislation, and even for 4 years from now, we're all supposed to be accessible in accordance with the ADA. So I just hope that are we there yet, is what I would ask. Are we really going to be fully accessible? I know we have legislation and laws in the AODA, and I know that's a key to have that standardization across Canada, but I just wonder if we're meeting those goals. But in terms of technology, and we're constantly learning how to use technology, and we have over this past year, and I'm just hoping that in the future, it's much more user-friendly and will allow for people to have that connection still, that we're just not reliant only on technology, but like we've mentioned, there's pros and cons, but we still need that human connection, that in-person connection where we can have the dialogue and connect with people in person as well, not just online.
Thanks, Bev. Danica, over to you, same question.
I think for me, when I think about the future of communication and inclusion and accessibility, I'm hopeful that including accessibility within any forms of communication will become more instinctive. I think we need to see with that legislation that Bev was discussing, and also within organizations and companies and public services, that they don't see accessibility as an extra step, that accessibility is something that is really thought of from the ground up. And I think accessibility, when you think of a universal design perspective, so making things better for everybody, there's many different features that have been developed for a certain group, but help many other people as well. So I think in terms of the future of accessibility and communication, I would hope that it is seen as just part of the process and not that extra step that they have to make something accessible or a chore in some way to make something accessible. I also agree with Bev. I think the more we use technology, the more doors it opens for individuals as well. But I think the in-person communication and the in-person aspects of communication are still very important. So I can kind of see a hybrid of things for individuals. So some people might still prefer the virtual setting, but others would prefer the in-person setting, and making sure that there's an understanding between the differences within accessibility of virtual and in person, because there are many differences between the two.
Thank you, Danica. Jolene, over to you.
There's a lot of things I'd like to see for the future, but firstly, just to say reinstate what Danica said, is that we need to stop putting this as an afterthought or an addition to pieces. And coming from a traditional background, that's always how it's been. It's like, oh, here's an extra piece to your website, and this is how much it is. You're giving people the option. It should not be an option. We would never build a building without wheelchair accessibility. We should not be building our marketing materials knowing that it's segregating part of the population. Especially what's near and dear to my heart is hiring people with disabilities to do your user testing and your planning and your designing, because we know what needs to be done. We understand how it needs to be presented and to engage more individuals. I think valuing the expertise and the contributions of people with disabilities in our community is super important. So rather than keep asking people to, quote unquote, volunteer and not properly compensating them, it's not the right thing to do. We need to engage everybody. If you want to make something accessible, you need to come to the experts. You go to the dentist because they're a dentist. You should be coming to people with disabilities because we are the experts. Just because we have a disability doesn't mean they aren't our superpowers. In our company, we call everyone that's our superpower because we are the expert. So I'd love to see more people engaging and participating rather than putting them into a category where, they're going to be on disability and people can't accommodate them. That's not the case. We need to rethink that.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jolene. I really appreciate the point of valuing people's expertise and contributions the same way that you would value expertise in other areas, rather than just asking people with disabilities to volunteer to help improve your product or give feedback on something.
Yep.
Before we open it up to audience questions, are there any final thoughts that you would like to share? Danica, we'll start with you.
I think for me, I covered most of what I want to share. I think my big takeaway is having accessibility and inclusion become more instinctive to everybody in the community. It doesn't matter kind of your knowledge around disability or accessibility. Everybody has a part to play within making the world more accessible.
Thanks, Danica. Jolene?
I would agree. I think the biggest thing is to keep educating. I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that are fear mongering and there's the threat of lawsuits and things like that, but that's not the reason people should be making decisions to make their materials accessible and inclusive, especially the usability side. Accessibility is always done via technical, rating. That's not necessarily true accessibility. That's not usability. So that's really my hope, is more people understand the importance of it and they engage with more people with disabilities to be able to understand what the needs are.
Thanks, Jolene. Bev, any final thoughts?
One thing that comes to mind all the time is that we need to work with us. We're deaf and hard of hearing. Anyone with a disability, we need to work together. From many, many years of experience, it's always been others making decisions and they're generally not appropriate. They don't meet our needs. We need to be asked first. I think that is very important, that we work together. And that's something that we need to have in the forefront of our mind for our work going forward.
Thanks, Bev. So before we open it up to audience questions, I'd like to ask the three of you a question of my own, if I may. So let's pretend that a member of our audience has a virtual event planned for tomorrow. After listening to our discussion, the person has just realized that the event will not be accessible and inclusive for all attendees. What should the person do?
I'll go first.
Sure.
I'll break the silence. I think it is try to seek out people that are asking for the accommodations to understand what it is they need and make every best effort to accommodate them however they can. And, if they have to spend extra time working to reach out to someone like Bev or another like CNIB, and to find out what needs to be done rather than panic and say, well, we're not going to worry about it. I think just take the extra time, understand what it is rather than looking at it as a hindrance, which is all too often a problem.
Bev, do you have any thoughts?
I do. I experience that quite often in my life. It applies all the time, actually. It's very rare that someone will ask directly, what is it you need? Very, very rare. I think there are a lot of excuses that people make, reasons why they're not or don't provide accommodation or make things accessible. We've got video remote interpreting as a service now that makes things, I won't say more available, but certainly requests can be accepted quicker because people aren't traveling so much. So I would always try my best to accommodate, figure out, work out a way to make things accessible for members of our community. I've tried to reach out before myself to get accommodations to access workshops and things, and it's very, very difficult to meet a lot of resistance. I would just say, based on my own experience, I would not want anyone else to have to be in my shoes and experience similar things. So I would put myself in their shoes and ask what they need.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bev. Danica, what do you think about our imaginary audience member right now who's planned an event for tomorrow that is likely not going to be accessible and inclusive for everyone? What should that person do?
I agree with what Jolene and Bev were saying as well. Kind of that best effort to try to make things accessible. But I think a big part of this too is kind of taking ownership of the fact that this event might not be fully accessible and having that up front to say, you know what, this is something that slipped, but this is something that our organization or myself, whatever the event might be, this is something that we need to work towards. So reaching out to see what people need, but then also taking ownership at the event and saying that this is something that slipped, but how in the future can they make things more accessible? And then working with the different disability groups that might be in their area to ensure that in the future, something like this doesn't happen again, because I think sometimes people don't always realize how to make things accessible, or it's that afterthought that accessibility from the beginning doesn't take as much time as it does when you think about it at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that if you fold it in from the beginning, it's not going to be sort of a last minute panic that's going to be very time consuming. Thank you so much to the three of you for your thoughtful answers to that question. I'll pass it over to Sherry now for questions from our audience.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm glad we have a good amount of time because we have a lot of questions. So
excellent.
Yeah, give me one sec. So we're going to start with our first one. What are some guidelines to help create inclusive focus groups? I'm not sure who wants to take that one, but Bev?
Everybody's thinking.
Yeah.
If you want to be sure and include all people with disabilities, deaf, and hard of hearing included, I would say that, again, you have to reach out. You need to reach out to individuals, to agencies, to anyone who is interested in being part of, let's say, a planning committee, a task force, or even a brief ad hoc meeting. Reach out, get the information you need. Well, I do have some experience with people who have who say they have an accessibility group or provide access, but they don't have anyone who needs the service on their committee. So again, I would try to reinforce the need to reach out, invite those people, and recognize their value.
Perfect. Wonderful answer, Bev. Thank you. Okay, so I have a question here. Do you have any recommendations for how to get the nothing about us without us message across to our employers, supervisors, workplaces?
I could try and answer that. That's just Jolene. I think there's no right or wrong answer yet for that. I think it's more about keeping the message of education and advocacy open in any workplace. I know for us, that's one of the reasons why we did build our company, is to be able to provide access to individuals that have been impacted by disability. So you can contact us. But as far as, employers and supervisors, sometimes it falls on ears that don't listen. We've heard it time and time again. I think you have to provide a good case, a written case for some people, which is unfortunate, but to keep advocating and keep sharing education about why it's so important, and it needs to be done that way. I see it all the time. It's just like, it's very frustrating. I'm very passionate about the fact that you should be hiring people. It doesn't matter if it's my company or anybody, you should be hiring people who live this day to day to be able to test it and understand it. And sometimes it takes actual demos. With one of our auditors who's blind, I can give a report to a client, but if they don't see him using JAWS, they still don't understand. And when I show them and we do the demo and he takes them through that, I've had some clients in tears because now they feel really bad. It's like, well, this is what we've been telling you. It's that important. You're not understanding. So I think it's really, humans are visual. They need to be able to see and understand why they need to do that. So to keep pushing, I don't have a specific answer, but that's some of my recommendations for sure.
No, this is Sherry. And yeah, that was great, Jolene. Thank you so much. If there's nothing else to add to that, I'll go on to our next question. So a little background. Since the pandemic started, technology, as we know, continues to evolve. I am a special education teacher. Back from March 2000 to June 2020 to June 2020, we were using the Zoom platform. So this put me at a disadvantage as there was no live automated captioning, including for many of my students who required it. Fast forward to the fall, and various platforms have improved their technology. And so like Zoom, live automated captions are available. The issue now seems to be that these live captions are not accurate. So on local or provincial accessibility committees that I am on, professional CART is provided. The question is, how do I advocate for professional live captioning for various situations which will cost money when, quote unquote, everyone is on board with the specific live automated captions offered from the various platforms? So the free options. I literally read the transcripts, and this has also caused barriers as they are not very accurate.
If I can respond to that. Zoom captions, you're right, they are not accurate. It may be perceived as good enough information there, but when you have a professional CART writer who are paid to do that job, you see the difference in the quality of work. You have to pay for that quality. Same thing with professional interpreters. There is a service and fee involved. It's not free. Service providers, boards out there generally don't get the need for professional services. They don't budget for access. There is no budget, no cost line for services like that. Well, how is a student supposed to learn if they depend on captioners and there are no captions provided that are accurate? How is a student who uses sign language supposed to succeed without an interpreter, a professional interpreter? So again, it comes down to education. It's very unfortunate that professional services do come at a cost, and boards are accountable for accessibility. Human rights are a huge issue, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Students have rights. They need accurate information, access to accurate information. And we have to lobby to make sure we convince people of the need of that and to include it in their budget lines.
Absolutely. Jolene or Danica, did you have anything to add to that?
It's Danica. This makes me think of allyship, which I know you discussed this week as well. So being that voice for those students and for the people who need those services, I think a lot of times it falls within those with disabilities to constantly be advocating for what their needs are. And sometimes it gets exhausting to do so. So I think just continuing to advocate for what your students need and make sure that their needs are being heard is the best advice that I could give.
Yeah, absolutely. Allyship is so important, Danica. You're so right. Jolene?
Yeah, I was just going to add, so not just thinking about me, but my youngest daughter has dwarfism. So from a mom perspective, when we were fighting for certain accommodations when she started school, you know, the human rights is a little bit different to the school board, but we were lucky to have a few people on the inside of the school fight with us that understood that just because the school board said this is how things were, didn't mean it was right. So I encourage you as a teacher to be that advocate like a mom would or a dad would for your students, because sometimes it takes a lot of voices for them to hear properly. And it's certainly crucial to the development of our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jolene. Okay, next question. So my question, since the pandemic began, businesses have abandoned AODA in favor of quote unquote public health recommendations. This has led to barriered consumers having to ignore their own needs, for example, masks or signage with sight loss, to avoid being targeted in public. Since our government extended the compliance date for AODA, this has gotten so much worse. How do we redirect this so that barriered consumers are safe to use their accommodations even in the current climate? How do we educate store owners and the public about medical privacy and accommodations so that it is safe when our government has not enforced this?
I can speak a little bit quickly. I 100% agree with you. I see one of my children has a heart condition, and they have a part where they overheat. So if they're masked for extended periods of time, they actually pass out. So it's been really frustrating. And I know from speaking to other friends that struggle with disabilities, there are some people who truly can't use masks, whether it's a skin condition, you know, they can maybe for a short-term period of time. But unfortunately, it's difficult because business owners are allowed to make their own rules. They're concerned from both sides. And being a business owner myself, you can't win, you can't lose. It seems like it's a never-ending fate with the whole masking side of it. So, and then somebody suggested, well, people with disabilities should use, you know, like the sunflower lanyard. And like, we shouldn't also have to put a target on ourselves that we have a disability. I have an invisible disability most of the time. It's called Ehlers-Danlos. You know, it's happened to me. I've used the wheelchair accessible pass for parking, didn't have my cane with me. You know, it's the same, it's perpetuated. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but it definitely is a real issue because of the people who say, oh, you can just hire someone to go get your stuff for you. Why? Because I have a disability, I have to go hire someone to go get something for me. Why? You feel like you're being judged for having a disability already. Like, it's not a healthy situation. I just don't know what that answer is, but I wanted to speak to it because I know many people who struggle with it, and it's not an easy case. So.
Bev or Danica, did you have anything to add? Bev, I know we had spoken about the masks in terms of communication. I don't know if that's
Yes,
something.
I wanted to speak to the mask issue.
Perfect. Great.
For deaf and hard of hearing individuals, it is extremely difficult with the situation with masking. We rely on facial expressions for communication. And so to have half of your face covered and to only be able to see people's eyes, but not be able to see their mouth movements, we've experienced a lot of attitude from individuals in the community, poor attitude around the issue of masking and people not being patient with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. We're trying to gesture and communicate with them and then or write out our notes or text it, like type it out on our phone before we go into a store. We have to prepare in advance to going out into public. And people are not used to very often communicating with deaf and hard of hearing individuals, but having the mask has made it doubly difficult because we're not able to see their facial expressions. So if you can socially distance even more and pull the mask down or gesture or be open to writing notes back and forth, but it is very challenging. Most deaf and hard of hearing people are ordering their groceries online, but then there's another problem with curbside pickup. You have to often phone when you arrive. You park in the parking spot and there's a phone number. Deaf and hard of hearing individuals may not use their phone. I've had to go in and say, I can't call you to say that I'm parked in number 3 spot to bring my groceries out to me. So I would like to applaud IKEA because they are the only place that I know that allows for texting at curbside pickup. So I can text to say that I'm in spot number 3. And that has been the best service. And I've actually made formal complaints to other companies who are only allowing voice phone calls at curbside pickup. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that would be my comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bev, for that perspective. Okay, we have another question. Here we go. So who would a graphic artist reach out to for training in designing or implementing marketing materials? Do you have any resources that you might share or someone that you might point them towards to look at making sure that the marketing materials they're creating are accessible?
Suppose that would be an answer for me for sure. Being a graphic designer myself, I seriously didn't grow up and be educated in accessibility until really my daughter was born and she's turning 10. There's more schools that are integrating it into their education. However, you have to take it upon yourself to find the resources. A lot of our team is finding, even the one good thing during COVID is there's been a lot of free resources, or very inexpensive. So there's, inclusion accessible design through Coursera. There's some through Google. We've done some private training ourselves for some of our clients, but there's also Accessibility Services Canada that has some pieces, but there's so many components of being a graphic designer, whether it's the actually making accessible documents or learning how to create accessible documents and the design of them, because it starts with color, it's the language, it's, including an icon with the text, and then of course building in descriptions for the images. There's not one answer to that, but if you do want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to give you some more information on that.
That's wonderful. We actually have a number of questions still, but we're being mindful of the time. We're going to have to sort of wrap things up now, but thank you all so much. Just a couple of closing comments. So thank you everyone for your participation today. We'd like to invite all of you to join us for our last day of our webinar series tomorrow by visiting the registration page on the City of Kitchener or the City of Cambridge websites. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the future of accessibility in technology. So many thanks to our organizing committee organizations, including the Independent Living Center of Waterloo Region, the CNIB Foundation, CHS, Canadian Hearing Services, Community Support Connections, KW Accessibility, Bridges to Belonging, KW Habilitation, and the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, who contributed towards our closed captioning, video relay service, and transcription service. I'd also like to thank all the panelists and our moderator today for making today's webinar such a great success. In a moment, a very short poll will appear on your screen. If you can please take a minute just to answer a couple of questions about today's event before leaving the webinar, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you and have a fabulous day. All right, well done, everybody. It was really, really good. So thank you, and